Hello, everybody. This is Frank with Iron Age News, South Florida Conservative News Center, Sunday, August 9th, 11:30. You will probably see this tomorrow, or maybe not. Doesn't really matter because we are going to talk about the push by the current administration, meaning Donald Trump and his administration, to make the United States even more self-sufficient energy-wise by, excuse me, adding nuclear power all over the place. So, for most of the last 50 years, I think we could say American presidents have talked about something called energy independence. And the idea is simple: America should produce enough energy that it would no longer be dangerously dependent on foreign suppliers, AKA the Arabs. But what if that goal is becoming obsolete? What if the United States is approaching this in a somewhat more grand manner, not energy independence, but energy abundance, which is the answer for the modern world? The Trump administration has launched one of the most aggressive efforts to expand nuclear power in decades. At the same time, it's encouraging greater oil and natural gas production and expanding America's role as a global energy exporter. Put these policies together, and an interesting strategy possibility begins to emerge. A future United States could use nuclear power to perform much more of the heavy lifting required by the domestic electrical system, while America's enormous natural gas and petroleum reserves increasingly become industrial and export assets. That is not an official Trump doctrine, but it may be where these pieces are pointing. And we're going to talk more about that now. Obviously, this is not straight doctrine from state or from atomic energy, but if you're watching the financial maneuverings and things of that nature, it does paint a more positive picture of this as being a road to which the Trump administration is looking down. So we can begin with where America is today. The United States currently has roughly 100 gigawatts, not gigawatts, as Professor Brown would tell you, 100 gigawatts of nuclear generating capacity. The Trump administration's target is approximately 400 gigawatts by 2050. And think about that for a moment, okay? Washington isn't talking about adding 5 or 10%. How do we say that? We're not talking about adding 5 or 10% to the American nuclear fleet. The objective is essentially to quadruple American nuclear capacity for energy, not for destruction, not for ships, for energy in the country. The administration has also called for 5 gigawatts of additional generation through uprating existing reactors and wants 10 new nuclear large reactors with complete designs under construction by 2030. Whether all those goals can actually be achieved is another question, because if the Democratic Party gets back in office, they will immediately shit can all this so that we can go back to the same old game playing, who has the oil and gas with the Arabs, because they will go back into shutdown in the United States again, right? So whether all these goals can be achieved is another question. Nuclear construction in the United States has historically been expensive, heavily regulated, and notoriously slow. But the scale of the ambition tells us something important. The administration isn't simply trying to keep America's existing nuclear power plants operating, it's trying to recreate an American nuclear industry. And he has a good chance of this going this direction for a reason. So we'll talk about the recent article or articles that have talked about President Trump has presided over the onlining of 4 nuclear reactors, which is more than anybody else, I think, in any other presidency. But you may have seen these claims and that they've come online, but that has to be clarified because 4 advanced nuclear reactor projects recently achieved criticality under the Department of Energy's Accelerated Reactor Program. And that's what's going on. That is significant, but criticality does not mean 4 commercial nuclear power plants suddenly started sending electricity into the grid. Criticality means that a reactor has achieved a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. Okay, so these were experimental or demonstrator reactors. So the headline should not be 4 new nuclear power plants opened. The more accurate headline would be 4 advanced American nuclear reactor designs successfully reached a major developmental milestone. Obviously, doesn't sound as good, but the two titles mean two different things, and they should be called on that as well. And that may ultimately be the more important because Washington is trying to shorten the journey between designing a reactor and actually deploying one. One of these demonstrations involving Antares Nuclear is intended to establish a technical foundation for subsequent reactors that can begin producing electricity in 2027 and beyond. Now, once again, in case I didn't mention it earlier, and I know I didn't, these are not the mini reactors that the president wants to purchase from Japan. These are the famous 3 Mile Island looking ones that people recognize in the United States, the cooling towers. So we're watching the beginnings of a potential production pipeline, which is amazing to think about considering each one of these old ones was like building a cathedral, you know? Nobody, one was built and that was it and went on. So they're going to be able to get these things produced, demonstrate the reactor, test it, license it, build commercial versions, then start producing electricity. If that cycle can be compressed substantially, which I think it can, anybody who goes back in an inspector general's format and with engineers will probably see that a lot of the hurdles were put in there for politics. If those are removed, I'm not saying you can build these things overnight, but you may be able to knock a quarter to a third of the time off of it. You also have to remember, and I'll probably talk about it again later, the sites for these things have been picked out for 40, 50 years. Everybody thinks that the United States government just gets up and does shit. Does now under Trump, but even he is not coming up with most of these things. He has had guys going out and cherry picking projects while he was in, in absentia down there in Palm Beach. And then he just was able to pull them out of his ass and go forward. All right. So there are already sites that have been picked out forever. And there's another important part of the strategy. The United States doesn't necessarily have to wait 10 years for newly constructed reactors before obtaining nuclear electricity, which, as I said, some reactors already exist. They just aren't operating. The Palisades nuclear plant in Michigan is being brought back. That's approximately 800 megawatts of generating capacity. The former 3 Mile Island Unit Number 1 in Pennsylvania, now called the Clean Energy Center because of, an accident, is also being restarted. That's another roughly 835 megawatts. Those two facilities alone represent more than 1.5 gigawatts of potential baseload electricity. And the Department of Energy has indicated that additional reactor restarts could follow. The administration's Uprise, which is the name of the clever little device they have, and it's called the Uprise Initiative, aims to add approximately 2.5 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2027 and 5 gigawatts by 2029. 5 gigawatts is roughly the generating capacity of 5 conventional large nuclear reactors. So the near-term strategy isn't simply, we're going to build a bunch of nuclear reactors. It's more sophisticated. It's restart what can be restarted, increase output from plants already operating, accelerate advanced reactors, and simultaneously prepare to construct large conventional reactors again. And why now? All right. It brings you to the obvious question, why? Well, why has nuclear power suddenly become so important? One of the answers to this is from our old friend, artificial intelligence. Data centers consume enormous amounts of electricity, and that demand is increasing rapidly. But AI is only part of that story. The United States is simultaneously trying to expand semiconductor manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, defense production, and other energy-intensive industries. If Washington is seriously thinking about reshoring industrial capacity, America is going to need a lot more electric, right? And industry doesn't merely need electricity, it needs reliable electricity. We are not in the world of brownouts or blackouts like other countries, although we're pretty damn close to it some places, right? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's where nuclear becomes extremely interesting. A nuclear reactor doesn't care whether the sun is shining or if it's a breezy day, right? It doesn't care. It can operate continuously for long periods and produce enormous quantities of electricity from a comparatively small physical footprint. That makes nuclear particularly well suited to what I would call the heavy lifting of the American electrical system. And then imagine if everybody had an electrical car, right? Why did the cars fail other than they were stupid? They failed because lack of electrical outlets, usually, or a lack of electrical capacity for them, and because it was just slap a dash put in there, right? Tell BMW as their stock continues to plummet. And this is where I think the administration's strategy is particularly interesting. And he had said he was going to do this for a while. And then when the deal with the Japanese came up, I went back and looked again to see what else was going on. And then this other article came up about the other four reactors. I said, my God, he couldn't have built them that quick. And we have clarified what went on there. So for years, American energy debates were framed as competitions, which is nuclear versus renewable, oil versus electric, all that bullshit, right? Green versus useful. But an energy abundant strategy doesn't necessarily require choosing one winner. The objective becomes finding the best job for each energy source. Okay. Imagine an American electrical system in which nuclear provides a much larger portion of dependable base load electricity, meaning the everyday stuff is all going on through that, right? Natural gas provides for flexible generation when the grid needs it. You know, when it like now, it's 11:30, it's probably 95 degrees out. If you're smart, you'll never put your air conditioning on in my county under over under like 77, which means it's still 80 in the house, but you're going to put fatigue onto the electrical system. I know most people don't give a shit, but if we actually had a breakdown, you would know a 90 some degree day down here with no air and no fans is no fun. All right. So we'll just put that to the side. So renewables, solar, all that other bullshit, additional electricity when they are economically useful, like a 90-degree day. If I had an array, which I've wanted to put out in the yard for years, I just don't have the money. If I were to be able to put an array out, I could run most of my house on solar during the day with a battery bank, get into the nighttime a bit, and then let Florida Power and Light rob me throughout the evening. That would be a good use of solar power. Doesn't work all the way up north, but it works here. And actually, we're getting a little too far south. A little bit above me is actually the sweet spot. Now, if you look at that kind of situation where we're pairing it off, it becomes a component system. Something interesting is going to happen. The United States begins optimizing its energy resources rather than simply consuming whatever it produces domestically. And natural gas is particularly important here. There's another misconception worth correcting. America does not need to become a net energy exporter. It does not need to do that. It already is one. Okay, it already is. We are in Europe pretty thick right now because the Europeans have a love-hate relationship with their other drug dealer, the Russians. All right, so we are charging them more than the Russians would charge them. But since they are paying the Ukrainians to kill Russians, they can't get enough of that sweet Russian gas. And so it goes. All right. At this point in the United States, 2026, it is already the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. American liquefied natural gas goes to Europe, it goes to Asia, it goes into an international energy market in which supply isn't merely an economic question, it is a geopolitical one. And we'll go back to Europe now, just because we should. Every additional source of reliable American LNG gives European countries another alternative to Russian natural gas. Because, like I said, it's kept the Russians from bringing Europe to its knees Because if they had said, well, you blew up Nord Stream pipeline and Nord Stream pipeline 2, I guess you don't want our gas so bad. Now they have a more expensive alternative. Let's not kid ourselves. A more expensive alternative, but an alternative nonetheless. As far as Asia goes, Japan, South Korea, and other partners that we have depend heavily on imported energy. American energy exports, therefore, accomplish several things simultaneously. We are generating revenue. They are improving America's trade position. They are strengthening our allies, and they reduce the leverage of competing energy suppliers. Energy becomes foreign policy. If you haven't seen that in the Strait of Hormuz, you are not paying attention. Go look at our newsletter, State of the Strait, right? And this leads to the larger hypothesis. We're getting to the end. You can stay awake for this much. Go do a bump and come back. And this leads to the larger hypothesis. Again, the Trump administration hasn't formally announced a doctrine saying nuclear powered America and export the hydrocarbons because everybody would go crazy in the left. But look at the direction of policy. Washington wants vastly more nuclear power. It wants more American oil and natural gas production. It wants more LNG export capacity. It wants more American manufacturing. It wants greater American energy security. None of these objectives contradict each other. They can enforce each other. If nuclear power eventually carries a significantly larger portion of domestic electrical demand, natural gas that otherwise would be burned continuously here for electricity becomes available for other purposes. And some will still generate electricity. Like I said, we support the American industries. We will feed the petrochemical sector, and some will go back into the world market to bring in even more money to the United States coffers. Oil is somewhat different because very little American electricity is generated from petroleum, before you ask. But the larger strategic principle remains. America could increasingly use its domestic nuclear resources for electricity while leveraging its enormous fossil fuel resources as both industrial inputs and strategic inputs. And that is fundamentally a different energy posture from the America of the 1970s. However, there is a problem. You can't simply announce that America will go from approximately 100 gigawatts of nuclear capacity to 400 gigawatts because somebody has to build all that. And this may become, again, another interesting industrial story of the next 20 years. America needs uranium. Then that uranium must be converted and enriched. Advanced reactors may require specialized fuel. Fuel must be fabricated. Reactors require nuclear qualified pumps, valves, et cetera, et cetera. Those have to be built. They require enormous forgings. They require turbines. They require cooling systems, and on and on and on and on. And then all the technical people, the welders, the pipe fitters, Gladys over there in HR, they all have to be brought in as well. It is a huge employment bonus. The United States cannot quadruple nuclear capacity without rebuilding the industrial ecosystem capable of constructing and maintaining nuclear power plants. That's why it isn't merely an energy story. And no, we can't sub out a lot of this work to other countries. National security. This is more dangerous to national security than the idea of having the hulls of some of the ships built in South Korea. This is for real, right? So it's an industrial base story. They need to get out there. They need to get cracking. They have to regulate what's going to go on with labor. The United States has a labor problem. Here's my aside because we're working on the issue here because of theoretical right to work states. All right. A lot of the illegal labor that occurs in this United States are in what would have been entry level or early advanced positions for American citizens getting out of high school or something like that. And across the racial rainbow. All right. We can't have it. It can't be out there, and it surely cannot be done around something like this. All right. So a lot of this has to get straightened out as far as foreign labor of all types in the United States, and especially in the nuclear energy field. And that, of course, is not being discussed at all. And it should be, because they know the minute they discuss it, it gives the anti-nuclear people yet another reason to put a bullet in something we need. All right. So that's the story with that. Now, if you are interested, there are a bunch of companies out there that you could look at if you were interested in investing. I would tell you take a look at our written version of this, which is South Florida Conservative. And if you do a little AI work on your own, since we are not stockbrokers or stock salesmen, you can start to develop an idea of an energy policy of investment, if you like, because we are getting more and more into evaluation of economic and financial issues. Um, there's also a national security dimension that shouldn't be ignored. For much of modern American history, the United States worried about protecting access to foreign energy. Oil shocks could damage the American economy, which we've seen. Instability in the Middle East could affect American consumers thousands of miles away, which we are seeing, but a lot of it has to do with the American oil companies profiting on the war. And there's nothing we can do, because since it's not a war, there's no war profiteering. Energy dependence constrained foreign policy. Okay, now let's reverse that equation. Imagine an America that produces considerably more energy than it requires. Domestic electricity increasingly comes from an enormous fleet of nuclear plants supplied by natural gas, renewables, and other sources. American oil production remains enormous. American liquefied natural gas terminals send natural gas throughout the world. America isn't competing desperately for somebody else's energy. Other countries are competing to access American energy. It is geopolitical leverage. And that's why I think the phrase energy independence may ultimately prove too limiting for what we're talking about here. Independence means we have enough for ourselves. Abundance means having enough for ourselves and enough left over to influence the world. Imagine if everybody from, we're not counting Mexico, they get their own stuff going on, Central America and South America, there are some countries that are energy strapped. Imagine if they had access to cheap sources of fuel, because they have to still build their own electrical generation. Cheap sources of fuel. Electric is one of the keystones slash rulers or metrics of a civilization in this day and age. The ability to generate electric. Same with Africa, right? Same kind of stuff going on there. So abundance meaning we have enough and enough to influence the world. There are extremely large, enormous, whatever obstacles between today's approximately 100 gigawatts and the administration's 400 gigawatt ambition. Regulatory reform has to work. There's a lot of stuff that's going on there. And America is talking about nuclear power as something to build rather than merely something to preserve. And if that continues, the result could extend far beyond the electrical grid. Once again, you have something that will be employing tens of thousands of workers. We have major construction issues around the United States, which we could easily solve if we regulated our labor to some extent, and not the stupid shit about Starbucks, but real people in real trades. That has to be resolved for this type of thing to operate. The companies that are going to supply products and services to these type of projects have to get on board. That has been the Trump administration's problem. A lot of the big corporations decided, we don't want to play that game. We'll wait and see what we can get out of the next guy. And that there should expose what everybody wants to hate about corporations. Not that they can't do the job, but they won't do the job, right? That is one of the big things that could stall this nuclear, I won't say renaissance, but definitely this gigantic expansion of nuclear power, like the likes of which we have never seen. So that's all I have for now. Enjoy your weekend, what's left of it. This will be out probably Monday on YouTube or wherever else we can get it, where we don't have to put it out immediately. And go check out our other stuff. And that's all I have for you now. Goodbye. Good luck.